Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'll be presenting on the effect of stressors on Anethum graveolens, or as it's more commonly known, a culinary herb, dill. Before I do that though, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Grayson Snead. I'm currently a senior at River High School, and after graduating here, I will be attending Furman University, where I will major in cellular biology in order to pursue a career in either virology or microbiology postgrad. My reason for choosing this topic stems from numerous factors, but the largest and most personal is my desire to pursue a STEM-related career, and my interest in many scientific fields, but specifically those of biology, microbiology, and more recently, anatomy. And I originally intended to focus my SRP research in the field of microbiology, but I was met with numerous complications involving both the practicality of my experiments and the accessibility to the equipment that I would need to perform these experiments. So at the end of my 21-22 school year, I was informed that I had the potential to work with a researcher, Dr. South. And Dr. South informed me that we would be doing something in the hydroponic fields. And this expansion was very exciting because it allowed me experience in a field that I never would have thought to look at prior. And this expansion also allowed me to realize how important this work is. Hydroponics is revolutionizing modern crop production, allowing for healthier crops to be produced at more efficient rates, while also limiting spatial demands and natural requirements. The fast growth cycles of crops in these systems allow for continuous experimentation in order to find optimal ranges or new methods for increased production. Spatial efficiency also allows these systems to exist in urban centers, bringing fresh production directly to cities that would otherwise be required to wait on shipment or not provide fresh options at all. My primary concern when setting out to address this field was to understand what exactly hydroponics was. So hydroponics is the cultivation of crops in a soulless medium, or in water, and there's many systems in this that can be utilized, such as the deep flow or the nutrient film technique, or NFT systems. A commonality between all of my sources, and something that I knew we would be using as well, was the NFT system. In these systems, troughs are placed at a slightly downward angle to allow water to run over the roots of crops in these systems. And this water has a nutrient concentration in it known as electrical conductivity, or EC. And typically, plants have optimal EC ranges that they prefer, and anything outside of this optimal range can harm the plant's development. Conventional fertilizers are reliant on non-renewable phosphorus, and scientists are attempting to limit this reliance through recycled fertilizers. Recycled fertilizers act as a supplement for this typical conventional fertilizer, and there are three main methods of recycled fertilizers that I researched. The first is the derision of minerals from wastewater treatment plants. And this means that as human excreta undergoes the treatment process, minerals such as struvite can be taken from it. And struvite is not as potent as a typical fertilizer would be, but it can act as a small supplement. The second is the recycling of system water, and this means treating an original harvest with a conventional phosphorus-heavy fertilizer, but all successive harvests use that original dosage. This is only ideal short-term though, because long-term the accumulation or depletion of certain minerals can harm plant development. And the final and the most important in understanding my research is the addition of non-indigenous parts. And this means adding a bacteria or a microbe to the plant to see how this addition affects development, typically when the plant's subject to a stressful condition. And this also happens to be why my experiment is significant, as it will serve as a comparison for an experiment redoing this by testing the addition of these parts. My research focused on understanding how stressful conditions, or specifically low EC levels, affect the development of dill. Dr. South and I chose to work with dill because a company that she works with suggested research on the herb, and literature lacks discussion in regards to how dill grows in low EC. My research led me to form the following hypotheses. In my research hypothesis, I stated that dill cultivated in low conditions, or 0.5 conditions, would experience hindered physical yields. So lower fresh weights, lower dry weights, and shorter heights. While alternatively, in my null, I stated that regardless of the EC the plants were exposed to, they would have very similar physical yields. In order to set up this experiment, we first had to establish our variables. Our main focus was EC, but we actually had two independent variables, and the second was the type of propagation cube that was used. We used Rockwool and Oasis propagation cubes, and this was done to ensure that in case all the plants in the low treatment were to die, I still had to present the topic. The dependent factor for both of these, though, was the development of the dill. The control would be the plants growing at their normal EC level, which is 1, and the constants were pH, temperature, and light exposure. After submitting the layout of our experiment, we were able to begin. We first took 144 Rockwool cubes and 144 Oasis cubes, and sowed 2 seeds to each cube and placed them in the propagation trays and allowed them to germinate. A week later, we went through and thinned the plants, meaning we left one plant to each cube and then allowed them to fully germinate. Before transplanting, we checked the pipes to all the systems to ensure that there were no leaks and any leaks were patched up. We had 8 blocks available to us in the greenhouse, and we randomly selected them so that 4 were treatment and 4 were control. Each block contained 6 rows that had 6 plants, and they were further divided so that each block contained 3 rows of rock wool cubes and 3 rows of oasis cubes. The plants were transferred from the propagation trays 19 days after germination. They were given a 2-day acclimation period before the first round of height measurements was taken. This was the first of 3 rounds of height measurements, and 6 plants were randomly selected from each block to be taken for height. We adjusted the pH and the EC as needed, but other than that, there was very little influence from Dr. South and I during this time. In preparation for harvest, plants were numbered 1 to 288. Before I discuss harvest with you, I want to take this moment to show you the visible differences in the treatments. The photo on the left is a block undergoing the low treatment, while the photo on the right is a block undergoing the normal treatment. These photos were taken on the same date, and these blocks are actually right next to each other in the greenhouse as well. The plants were harvested 30 days after transplant, and they could have been harvested sooner, but we wanted to ensure adequate growth time. During harvest, the plants were cut at their base and placed on a cart with their number, and this was done 1 row at a time. The cart was then taken to a table, and the plants were placed on a scale to be measured for fresh weight. Fresh weight was documented, and the plants were placed in bags that had the plant's number and my initials on them, and then placed into a bin. After all the plants had undergone the fresh weight documentation process, the bins were taken to a separate greenhouse and placed in a drying oven that was set at 60 degrees Celsius. This oven would remove all the water from the plants so they could then be measured for dry weight. Within the following week, dry weights were documented and plants were disposed of. I compiled heights, fresh weights, and dry weights into an Excel spreadsheet, and my statistical test consisted of a 2-way ANOVA. The 2-way ANOVA was actually performed twice, once with fresh weight and once with dry weight. I chose to leave height out of the final statistical analysis, and we chose to measure fresh and dry weights because they are common measurements within the field to judge crop quantity. And for both of these tests at a significance level of 0.05, there was sufficient evidence to reject the null hypothesis with p-values of less than 0.001. Interestingly, the ANOVA showed no statistically significant relationship between the substrates and dill growth, nor that these substrates interacted with EC to aid or inhibit growth. And this was reflected in the chart with the average fresh rates being similar regardless of the substrate they were grown in. As you can see, the plants grown in both substrates in the 0.5 treatment had much lower average fresh weights, being pretty uniform around 7 grams, while the averages of plants in both substrates in the normal treatment are around 26 grams. And this chart displays data very similar to the first, but with dry weight. It's also very similar in regards to trend as well, with both substrates of the low treatment being just under 1 gram, and both substrates of the normal treatment around 2.5 grams. And with all the data found in the test run, we ask ourselves one of the most important questions: what does it all mean? So to restate, at a 0.05 level of significance, there is sufficient evidence to suggest that dill grown in low EC suffers significantly hindered growth. Truth be told, I did not expect that much of a difference, and I was actually hoping the yields would be much closer in the end. On a chemical level, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but my understanding of the literature allows me to believe these plants don't have enough nutrients. As I mentioned at the start of my presentation, the overarching purpose of this experiment is for its results to act as a comparison. The data from this will go on to be compared with the results of a study redoing this but testing the addition of bacteria. And these results could support the fact that this addition aids in the development of plants in low EC environments. And should this addition appear beneficial to plant growth, it can mean great things both economically and environmentally. The acquisition of phosphorus requires large amounts of energy and results in large gas emissions, while recycled fertilizers tend to be composed of organic matter and derived from industrial processes. Economically, the price of these fertilizers is not linked to the availability of phosphorus, and prices tend to be more stable and fertilizers more available. Addition could also further increase yield, allowing for higher consumption and therefore larger profit. There are a few occurrences that I've chosen to mark as limitations, and the first is a faulty trough in block 19. By this I mean the water access to this trough cut off, so the plants were not receiving any nutrients, and by the time that we realized lack of water was the problem, all the plants had died. Another issue is the presence of multiple plants in cubes, and this happened in about 3 of the cubes, with 2 of them having 2 plants and 1 of them having 3 plants. In these instances, we randomly selected 1 plant to be measured for raw data. I think this would have been a larger issue in the low treatment as well, as competition for nutrients was already increased. The final limitation was the loss of some plants, and by this I mean that throughout the 8 blocks we had 5 plants die due to unknown causes. And this, along with the first limitation, required zeros be put in order for the statistical analysis to be performed. And while I do not think these few zeros created any large discrepancies, it's important that they be noted. I thoroughly enjoyed this experiment, and I believe it allowed me to learn a lot. I'm very interested in science, but I have a focus in biology and microbiology, so I never originally thought to extend into agriculture or hydroponics. And this experiment allowed me to try something new in a very hands-on and engaging manner. I never expected to be so excited to go check on dill plants as a 17-year-old, but after the conclusion of this experiment, I miss getting to go out there every other day. I also think this was one of the most productive exposures to the research process that I could have had as a high schooler. This process allowed me to conduct professional research, compose and perform statistical analysis, and become comfortable with presenting to large groups. And this experiment also provided me with a more open mind when considering other branches and future career paths. On top of having fun, I now also have a greater understanding and appreciation for both agriculture and hydroponic practices. As I come to the conclusion of my presentation, I would like to take this moment to thank a few people. Dr. South is the only reason I was able to participate in this experiment, so thank you to Dr. South for making this whole process fun. I really enjoyed being able to work with you. You guided me through a complicated process and made sure I understood it the whole way through. I would also like to thank some of my Piedmont Governor School teachers. Thank you to Ms. Gravitt for helping me solidify my statistical test and providing me with resources to both perform and understand it. And thank you to Ms. Long for helping me throughout the whole process, whether that was how to structure my results or answering the same question even if I had already asked it prior. The classroom environment that you created facilitated creativity and hard work, but also fun. Thank you. Any questions?
So I noticed that you had access to a greenhouse for your project, and there was another student, Mrs. Van Valkenburg, indicated that she would have liked to have been able to do her research in the greenhouse. So was the access for all students with the same access and the same equity with being able to access the greenhouse?
So the greenhouse is property of the Institute, and Dr. South is employed through the Institute. And throughout the past few years, we've had researchers reach out to students and say, hey, I'm doing this project. Is there anybody that would like to join on? And so I had that opportunity provided to me, and that's the reason I was able to use the greenhouse.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Do you see this as a viable option for farmers? You know, we are dirt farmers in Pennsylvania County. Do you see this as the future of farming? I think you mentioned that.
So Dr. Jones asked if I see this as a future potential for Pennsylvania County specifically, and I definitely do, but it kind of depends on the personal preferences of the farmers here as to whether they prefer to stay in their traditional farming methods or also extend into hydroponic practices. So it's definitely an option, but it would be up to the community. Sure.
Can you clarify what your timeline of the project?
So this happened from October to December, roughly. As well.
You ran through the qualities of EC and a whole bunch of other things really quickly, and I just would need a clarification. Can you explain what EC is again?
It is the measure of the nutrients in the water. So it's just a quantitative measurement of how many nutrients the plants have available to them.
So in your study, you had a level of a 0.5 level of nutrients and a 1.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So what does that mean in terms of like amount of?
So Ms. Waltz asked for determine the amount of EC, and it kind of differs depending on how much. So we use millisiemens per centimeter, which is a very scientific way of saying how much is in there.
Yeah.
And if I could clarify that for you in more layman's terms, I would, but I can't either.
Sure.
But it's just a ratio of how much fertilizer is mixed with the water.